Hey everybody, my name is Hannah Vickery, and I was a camp counselor at Lucky Lana a few summers ago, and it was one of the best summers of my life. And one of my favorite parts of it was after we would have a campfire and sing some songs, we would go back to the cabins and everyone would get ready for bed, and then we'd read a bedtime story. And so I get to do some of that tonight. We're going to be reading Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So I just encourage you to go get changed in your pajamas or something comfortable and grab a cup of hot cocoa or something nice and cozy and get ready to hear the story. Alice in Wonderland, Chapter 6, Pig and Pepper. For a minute or two, she stood looking at the house, wondering what to do next, when suddenly a footman in livery came running out of the wood. She considered him a footman only because he was in livery. Otherwise, judging by his face only, she would have called him a fish, and rapped loudly at the door with his knuckles. It was opened by another footman in livery with a brown face and large eyes like a frog, and both footmen, Alice noticed, had powdered hair that curled all over their heads. She felt very curious to know what it was all about, and crept a little way out of the wood to listen. The fish footman began by producing from under his arm a great letter, nearly as large as himself, and this he handed over to the other, saying in a solemn tone, "For the Duchess, an invitation from the Queen to play croquet." The frog footman repeated in the same solemn tone, only changing the order of the words a little to, "From the Queen, an invitation for the Duchess to play croquet." Then they bowed low, and their curls got tangled together. Alice laughed so much at this that she had to run back into the wood for fear of them hearing her, and when she next peeped out, the fish footman was gone, and the other was sitting on the ground near the door, staring stupidly up into the sky. Alice went timidly up to the door and knocked. "There's no sorts of use in knocking," said the footman, "and that is for 2 reasons. First, because I'm on the same side of the door as you. Secondly, because they're making such a noise inside, no one could possibly hear you." And certainly there was a most extraordinary noise going on within, a constant howling and sneezing, and every now and then a great crash, as if a dish or a kettle had been broken into pieces. "Please, then," said Alice, "how am I supposed to get in?" "There might be some sense in your knocking," said the footman, went on, without even attending to her, "if we had a door between us. For instance, if you were on the inside, you might knock, and I could let you out, you know." He was looking up into the sky all the time he was speaking, and this Alice thought decidedly was uncivil. Perhaps he can't help it, she thought. His eyes are so very nearly at the top of his head. But at any rate, he might answer me. And my questions. "How am I to get in?" she repeated out loud. "I shall stay here," the footman remarked, "till morning." At this moment, the door of the house opened, and a large plate came skimming out, straight at the footman's head. It just grazed his nose, and it broke into pieces outside against one of the trees behind him. "Or the next, maybe," the footman continued in the same tone, exactly if nothing had happened. "How am I supposed to get in?" asked Alice again, this time in a louder tone. "Are you going to get in at all?" said the footman. "That's the first question, you know." It was, no doubt, only Alice didn't like being told so. "It is really dreadful," she muttered to herself, "the way all these creatures argue. It's enough to drive one crazy." The footman seemed to think this was a good opportunity for repeating his mark, with variations of, "I shall stay here," he said, "on and off for days and days." "But what am I to do?" said Alice. "Anything you like," said the footman, and began to whistle. "Oh, there's no use in talking to him," said Alice desperately. "He's perfectly idiotic." And she opened the door and went in. The door led right into a large kitchen, which was full of smoke from one end to the other. The Duchess was sitting on a 3-legged stool in the middle, nursing a baby, and the cook was leaning over the fire, stirring a large cauldron which seemed to be full of soup. "There's certainly too much pepper in that soup," Alice said to herself. As well she could be for sneezing. There was certainly too much of it in the air. Even the Duchess sneezed occasionally, and as for the baby, it was sneezing and howling alternately without a moment's pause. The only things in the kitchen that did not cease were the cook and the large cat, which was sitting on the earth, grinning from ear to ear. "Please, would you tell me," said Alice a little timidly, for she was not quite sure whether it was good manners for her to speak first, "why does your cat grin like that?" "It's a Cheshire Cat," said the Duchess, "and that's why." "Pig!" She said the last word with sudden violence, and then Alice quite jumped. But she saw in another moment that it was addressed to the baby, and not to her, so she took courage and went on again. "I didn't know that Cheshires always grinned. In fact, I didn't know cats could grin." "They all can," said the Duchess, "and most of them do." "I don't know any of that do," Alice said very politely, feeling quite pleased that she had gotten into a conversation. "You don't know much," said the Duchess, "and that's a fact." Alice didn't like the tone of this remark, and thought it would be as well to introduce some other subject of conversation. While she was trying to fix on one, the cook took the cauldron of soup off the fire, and at once set to work throwing everything within her reach at the Duchess and the baby. The fire irons came first, then followed a shower of saucepans, plates, and dishes. The Duchess took no notice of them, even when they hit her, and the baby was howling so much already that it was quite impossible to say whether the blows hurt it or not. "Oh, please mind what you're doing!" cried Alice, jumping up and down in agony of terror. "Oh, there goes his precious nose!" as an unusually large saucepan flew close by it and very nearly carried it off. "If everybody minded their own business," the Duchess said in a hoarse growl, "the world would go around a deal faster than it does." "Which would not be an advantage," said Alice, who felt very glad to get an opportunity of showing off a little of her knowledge. "Just think of what work it would make with the day and night. You see, the earth takes 24 hours to turn around on its axis." "Talking of axes," said the Duchess, "chop off her head." Alice glanced around anxiously at the cook to see if she meant to take the hint, but the cook was busily stirring the soup and seemed not to be listening, so she went on again. 24 hours, I think. Or is it 12? "Oh, don't bother me," said the Duchess. "I never could abide figures." And with that she began nursing her child again, singing a sort of lullaby as she did so, and giving it a violent shake at the end of every line. "Speak roughly to your little boy, and beat him when he sneezes. He only does it to annoy, because he knows it teases." Now the chorus, in which the cook and the baby joined. "Wow, wow, wow!" While the Duchess sang the second verse of the song, she kept tossing the baby violently up and down, and the poor little thing howled so that Alice could hardly hear the words. "I speak severely to my boy, and beat him when he sneezes, for he can thoroughly enjoy the pepper when he pleases." And now the chorus. "Wow, wow, wow!" "Here, you may nurse it a bit if you like," said the Duchess to Alice, flinging the baby at her as she spoke. "I must go and get ready to play croquet with the queen," and she hurried out of the room. The cook threw a frying pan after her as she went, but it just missed her. Alice caught the baby with some difficulty, as it was a queer-shaped little creature, and held out its arms and legs in all directions. "Just like a starfish," thought Alice. The poor little thing was sort of snorting like a steam engine when she caught it, and it kept doubling itself up and straightening itself out again, so that altogether for the first minute or two it was as much as she could do to hold it. As soon as she had made the proper way of nursing it, which was to twist it up in some sort of knot, and then keep tight hold of its right ear and left foot so as to prevent it from undoing itself, she carried it out into the open air. "If I don't take this child away with me," thought Alice, "they're sure to kill it in a day or two. Wouldn't it be murder to leave it behind?" She said the last two words out loud, and the little thing grunted in reply. It had left off the sneezing by this time. "Don't grunt," said Alice. "That's not a very proper way of expressing oneself." The baby grunted again, and Alice looked very anxiously into its face to see what was the matter with it. There could be no doubt that it was a very turn-up nose, much more like a snout than a real nose, and also its eyes were extremely small for a baby. Altogether, Alice did not like the look of the thing at all. Perhaps it's only because it was sobbing, she thought, and looked into its eyes again to see if there were any tears. No, there were no tears. "If you're going to turn into a pig, my dear," said Alice seriously, "I'll have nothing more to do with you. Mind now." The poor little thing sobbed again, or grunted, it's impossible to say which, and they went on for some way in silence. Alice was just beginning to think to herself, "Now, what am I supposed to do with the creature when I get home?" when it grunted again, so violently that she looked down into its face in some alarm. This time, there could be no mistake about it. It was neither more nor less than a pig. And she felt it would be quite absurd for her to carry it any further. So she set the little creature down and felt quite relieved to see it trot away quietly into the wood. "If it had grown up," she said to herself, "it would have made a dreadfully ugly child. But it does make a rather handsome pig, I think." And she began thinking over other children she knew who might do very well as pigs, and was just saying to herself, if only one knew the right way to change them, when she was a little startled by seeing the Cheshire Cat sitting in the bough of a tree a few yards off. The cat only grinned when it saw Alice. It looked good-natured, she thought. Still, it had very long claws and a great many teeth, so she felt it ought to be treated with respect. "Cheshire Puss," she began rather timidly, as she did not know whether it would like the name. However, it only grinned a little wider. "Come, it's pleased so far," thought Alice, and she went on. "Would you tell me, please, which way I ought to go from here?" "Well, that depends a great deal on where you want to get to," said the cat. I don't care where," said Alice. "Then it does not matter which way you go," said the cat. "So as long as I get somewhere," Alice added as an explanation. "Oh, you're sure to do that," said the cat, "if only you walk long enough." Alice felt that this could not be denied, so she tried another question. "What sort of people live about here?" "In that direction," the cat said, waving its right paw around, "lives a hatter, and in that direction," waving the other paw, "lives March Hare. Visit either you like. They're both mad." "But I don't want to go among mad people," Alice remarked. "Oh, you can't help that," said the cat. "We're all mad here. I'm mad, you're mad." "How do you know I'm mad?" said Alice. "You must be," said the cat, "or you wouldn't have come here." Alice didn't think that proved at all. However, she went on, "And how do you know that you're mad?" "To begin with," said the cat, "a dog's not mad." "You grant that?" "I suppose so," said Alice. "Well then," said the cat, "you see, a dog growls when it's angry and wags its tail when it's pleased. Now I growl when I'm pleased, and I wag my tail when I'm angry. Therefore, I'm mad." "I call it purring, not growling," said Alice. "Call it what you like," said the cat. "Do you play croquet with the Queen today?" "I should like it very much," said Alice, "but I haven't been invited yet." "Ah, you'll see me there," said the cat, and vanished. Alice was not much surprised at this. She was getting so used to the queer things happening. While she was looking at the place where it had been, it suddenly appeared again. "By and by, what became of the baby?" said the cat. "I'd nearly forgotten to ask." "It turned into a pig," Alice said quietly, just as it had come back in a natural way. "Oh, I thought it would," said the cat, and vanished again. Alice waited a little, half expecting to see it again, but it did not appear, and after a minute or two she walked in the direction of which March Hare was said to live. "I've seen hatters before," she said to herself. "The March Hare will be much more interesting, and perhaps it may not be as raving mad, or at least not as mad as it was in March." As she said this, she looked up, and there was the cat, sitting again in the branch of a tree. "Did you say pig or fig?" said the cat. I said pig, replied Alice, and I wish you wouldn't keep appearing and vanishing so suddenly. You make one quite giddy. All right, said the cat, and this time it vanished quite slowly, beginning with the end of its tail and ending with a grin, which remained some time after the rest of it had gone. Well, I've often seen a cat without a grin, thought Alice, but a grin without a cat? It's the most curious thing I've ever seen in my life. She had not gone much farther before she came to the sight of the house of the March Hare, and she thought it might be the right house, because the chimneys were shaped like ears, and the roof was thatched with fur. It was so large of a house that she did not like to go nearer till she had nibbled more of the left-hand bit of mushroom, and she raised herself to about 2 feet high. Even then she walked up towards it rather timidly, saying to herself, "Suppose it should be raving mad after all. I almost wish I had gone to see the Hatter instead." Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, Chapter 7, A Mad Tea Party. There was a table set out under a tree in front of the house, and the March Hare and the Hatter were having tea at it. A Dormouse was sitting between them, fast asleep, and the other two were using it as a cushion, resting their elbows on it and talking over its head. Very uncomfortable for the Dormouse, thought Alice, only it's asleep. I suppose it doesn't mind. The table was a large one, but the three were all crowded together in one corner of it. "No room! No room!" they cried, as when they saw Alice coming. "There's plenty of room," said Alice indignantly, and she sat down in a large armchair at one end of the table. "Have some wine," said the March Hare in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. "I don't see any wine," she remarked. "That's because there isn't any," said the March Hare. "Then it wasn't very civil for you to offer it," said Alice angrily. "And it wasn't very civil for you to sit down without being invited," said the March Hare. "I didn't know it was your table," said Alice. "It's laid out for a great many more than 3. "Your hair wants a cutting," said the Hatter. He had been looking at Alice for some time with great curiosity, and this was his first speech. "You should learn not to make personal remarks," Alice said with some severity. "It's very rude." The Hatter opened his eyes very wide on hearing this, but all he said was, "Why is a raven like a writing desk?" "Come, we shall have some fun now," thought Alice. "I'm glad they've begun asking riddles. I believe I can guess that," she added out loud. "Do you mean you think you can find out the answer to it?" said the March Hare. "Exactly so," said Alice. "Then you should say, 'Which me?'" said the March Hare. "I do," Alice hastily replied. "At least, I mean what I say. That's the same thing, you know." "Not the same thing a bit," said the Hatter. "You might as well just say, 'I see what I eat' is the same thing as 'I eat what I see.'" "You might as well say," added the March Hare, "that I like what I get is the same thing as I get what I like." "You might as well say," added the Dormouse, who seemed to be talking asleep, "that I breathe when I sleep is the same as I sleep when I breathe." "It is the same with you," said the Hatter, and here the conversation dropped, and the party sat silent for a moment, while Alice thought over all she could remember about ravens and writing desks, which wasn't very much. The Hatter was the first to break the silence. "What day of the month is it?" he said, turning to Alice, and he had taken out of his watch out of his pocket, and was looking at it uneasily, shaking it every now and then holding it to his ear. Alice considered a little, and then said, "The 4th. "2 days wrong," said the Hatter. "I told you butter it wouldn't suit the works," he added, looking angrily at the March Hare. "It was the best butter," the March Hare meekly replied. "Yes, but some crumb must have gotten in it as well," the Hatter grumbled. "You should have put it in the bread knife." The March Hare took the watch and looked at it gloomily, and then he dipped it into his cup of tea and laid it out again, and he could think of nothing better to say as his first remark. It was the best butter, you know." Alice had been looking over his shoulder with some curiosity. "What a funny watch," she remarked. "It tells the day of the month, and it doesn't tell what time it is." "Why should it?" muttered the Hatter. "Does your watch tell you what time it is?" Of course," replied Alice wearily. "Does your watch tell you what year it is?" "Of course not," replied Alice. But that's because it stays the same year for such a long time together. Which is the case with mine, said the Hatter. Alice felt dreadfully puzzled. The Hatter's remark seemed to have no sort of meaning in it, and yet was certainly English. I don't understand you, she said as politely as she could. The Dormouse is asleep again, said the Hatter, and poured a little hot tea upon his nose. The Dormouse shook his head impatiently and said, without opening his eyes, of course, just as what I was going to remark myself. Have you guessed the riddle yet? The Hatter said, turning to Alice. No, I give up, Alice replied. What's the answer? I haven't the slightest idea, said the Hatter. Nor I, said the March Hare. Alice sighed wearily. I think you might do something better with the time, she said, than wasting and asking riddles that have no answers. If you knew time as well as I do, said the Hatter, you wouldn't be talking about wasting it. It's him. I don't know what you mean, said Alice. Of course you don't, the Hatter said, tossing his head contemptuously. I dare you say you never even spoke to time. Perhaps not, Alice cautiously replied, but I know I would have to beat time when I learn music. Ah, that accounts for it, said the Hatter. He won't stand beaten. Now, if you could only keep on good terms with him, for he'd do almost anything he liked with the clock. For instance, suppose it went 9 o'clock in the morning, just the time to begin lessons. You'd only have to whisper out, hit the time, and round the clock in a twinkling, 1:30, time for dinner. I only wish it was, said the March Hare to itself in a whisper. That would be grand, certainly, said Alice. But then, I wouldn't be hungry for it, you know. Not at first, perhaps, said the Hatter, but keep it at 1:30 as long as you like. Is that the way you manage? Alice asked. The Hatter shook his head mournfully. Not I, he said. We quarreled last March, just before he went mad, you know, pointing at his teaspoon at the March Hare. It was a great concert given by the Queen of Hearts, and I had to sing, Twinkle, twinkle, little bat, how I wonder where you at. You know the song, perhaps. I heard something like it, said Alice. It goes on, you know, the Hatter replied, and it's this way. Up around the world to fly, like a tea tray in the sky, twinkle, twinkle. Here the Dormouse shook itself and began singing in its sleep to Twinkle, 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 and went so long they had to pinch it to make it stop. Well, I've hardly finished the first verse, said the Hatter, when the Queen jumped up and bawled out, He's murdering time! Off with his head! How dreadfully savage! Exclaimed Alice. And ever since that, the Hatter went on in a mournful tone, he won't do a thing I ask. It's always 6 o'clock now. A bright idea came into Alice's head. Is that the reason so many tea things are put out here? She asked. Yes, that's it, said the Hatter with a sigh. It's always tea time, and we no time to wash the things between the whiles. Then you keep moving around, I suppose, said Alice. Exactly so, said the Hatter, as things get used up. But what happens when you come to the beginning again? Alice ventured to ask. Suppose we change the subject, said the March Hare, interrupted, yawning. I'm getting tired of this. I vote the young lady tells us a story. I'm afraid I don't know one, said Alice, rather alarmed at the proposal. Then the Dormouse shall, they both cried. Wake up, Dormouse! And they both pinched it at both sides at once. The Dormouse slowly opened his eyes and said, I wasn't asleep. And he said in his hoarse, feeble voice, I heard every word you fellows were saying. Tell us a story, said the March Hare. Yes, please do, pleaded Alice, and be quick about it, added the Hatter, or you'll be asleep again before it's done. Once upon a time, there were 3 little sisters, the Dormouse began in a great hurry, and their names were Elsie, Lacy, Tilly, and they lived at the bottom of the well. What did they live on? Said Alice, who always took a great interest in questions of eating and drinking. They lived on a treacle, said the Dormouse, after thinking a minute or two. They couldn't have done that, you know, Alice gently remarked. They've been very ill. So they were, said the Dormouse. Very ill. Alice tried to fancy to herself what sort of extraordinary ways of living would be like, but it puzzled her too much, so she went on. But why do they live at the bottom of the well? to take more tea," said the March Hare to Alice very earnestly. "I've had nothing yet," Alice replied in an offended tone, "so I can't take more." "You mean you can't take less? It's very easy to take more than nothing." "Nobody asked your opinion," said Alice. "Ah, who's making personal remarks now?" the Hatter said triumphantly. Alice didn't quite know what to say to this, so she helped herself to tea and bread and butter, and then turned to the Dormouse and repeated her question. Why did they live at the bottom of a well? The Dormouse again took a minute or two to think about it, and then said, "It was a treacle well." "There's no such thing!" Alice was beginning to be very angrily, but the Hatter and March Hare went shh, 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 and the Dormouse sulkily replied, "If you can't be civil, you better finish the story yourself." "No, please go on," Alice said very humbly. "I won't interrupt again. I dare to say that there may be one." "One indeed," the Dormouse said indignantly. However, he consented to go on. "And so, these three little sisters, they were learning to draw, you know." "What did you draw? What did they draw?" said Alice, quite forgetting her promise. "Treacle," said the Dormouse, without considering it all this time. "I want a clean cup," interrupted the Hatter. "Let's all move one place down." He moved as he spoke, and the Dormouse followed him, and then the March Hare moved into the Dormouse's place, and Alice, quite rather unwillingly, took the place of the March Hare. The Hatter was the only one who got any advantage from the change, and Alice was a good deal worse off than before, as the March Hare had just upset the milk jug onto his plate. Alice did not wish to offend the Dormouse again, so she began very cautiously. "But I don't understand. Where did they draw the treacle from?" "You can draw water out of a water well," said the Hatter, "so I think you could draw a treacle out of a treacle well. Stupid!" "But they were in the well," Alice said to the Dormouse, not choosing to notice this last remark. "Of course they were," said the Dormouse. "Well in." This answer so confused poor Alice that she let the Dormouse go on for some time without interrupting it. "They were learning to draw," the Dormouse went on, yawning and rubbing its eyes, for it was getting very tired. And they drew all manner of things, everything that begins with an M." Why with an M?" said Alice. "Why not?" said the March Hare. Alice was silent. The Dormouse had closed its eyes by this time and was going off into a doze, but on being pinched by the Hatter, it woke up again with a little shriek and went on. "That begins with an M, such as mouse traps and the moon and memory and muchness. You know you say things that are much of a muchness. Did you ever say a thing as a drawing of a muchness?" "Really now, you ask me," said Alice, very much confused. "I don't think—" "Then you shouldn't talk," said the Hatter. This piece of rudeness was more than Alice could bear, and she got up with great disgust and walked off, and the Dormouse fell asleep instantly, and neither of the others took the least notice of her going, though she looked back once or twice, half hoping they would call after her, and the last time she saw them, they were trying to put the Dormouse into the teapot.